What if the very thing that makes an avoidant pull away is also the thing that can make them unable to stop thinking about you? It sounds contradictory. After all, avoidants are known for creating distance. They're the people who seem uncomfortable with too much closeness, the people who take forever to text back, the people who suddenly become cold after things start getting serious, the people who act like they don't need anyone. So, how is it possible that the same person who seems emotionally unavailable can become completely consumed by thoughts of someone they once took for granted? The answer lies in a psychological blind spot that most people never notice. And once you understand it, you'll start seeing avoidant behavior in a completely different way. Because the truth is that avoidants are often misunderstood. People assume they don't care. People assume they're incapable of deep feelings. People assume they're naturally detached. But in many cases, none of those assumptions are true. Most avoidants feel just as deeply as everyone else. The difference is that they've learned to hide those feelings, even from themselves. And that's where the real story begins. Imagine meeting someone who makes you feel safe, valued, and understood. At first, everything feels exciting. You talk constantly. You share personal details. You enjoy each other's company. The connection grows stronger. But then something strange starts happening. As the relationship deepens, one person becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Not because they dislike the connection, not because they're losing interest, but because intimacy itself begins triggering anxiety. This is the hidden reality many avoidants experience. The closer someone gets, the more vulnerable they feel. And vulnerability is exactly what they've spent years trying to avoid. To understand why, we need to look beneath the surface. Many avoidants grew up learning that emotional dependence was risky. Maybe their feelings weren't validated. Maybe affection was inconsistent. Maybe they learned that relying on others often led to disappointment. Over time, they developed a powerful coping mechanism: self-reliance. Independence became safety. Distance became protection. Emotional walls became survival tools. As adults, these patterns often continue. Without realizing it, avoidants start associating closeness with danger. The more attached they become, the more threatened they feel. And when that discomfort appears, they usually respond the same way. They create space. They pull back. They become less available. They focus on work. They focus on hobbies. They convince themselves they need freedom. Anything that helps them regain a sense of emotional control. At first glance, this behavior looks like confidence. It looks like independence. It looks like someone who doesn't care. But beneath the surface, something very different is happening. They're managing fear. Fear of losing themselves. Fear of being hurt. Fear of becoming emotionally dependent. Fear of rejection. Ironically, the very people who seem least affected by relationships are often working hardest to avoid emotional pain. Now, here's where things get interesting. As long as the avoidant feels in control, these fears remain manageable. As long as they believe they can leave whenever they want. As long as they believe the other person will always be available. As long as they feel emotionally safe behind their walls, everything seems fine. But the moment that certainty disappears, everything changes. Let's say the person they've been keeping at arm's length suddenly stops chasing. No more emotional check-ins. No more long messages. No more attempts to reconnect. No more constant availability. Suddenly, the dynamic shifts. For the first time, the avoidant isn't controlling the distance anymore. Someone else is. And that's when their ego starts feeling something it hasn't felt in a very long time. Threatened. Not necessarily because they're narcissistic, not because they're selfish, but because the situation challenges a deeply held belief. The belief that they're always the one choosing distance. The belief that they're always in control. The belief that they can take or leave the relationship whenever they want. Now they're confronted with a completely different reality. What if the other person doesn't want me anymore? What if they're moving on? What if they stop caring? What if I lose access to them forever? These questions create psychological tension, And the human brain hates unresolved tension. In fact, research consistently shows that uncertainty often creates stronger mental fixation than certainty. When we don't know where we stand, our minds keep searching for answers. We replay conversations. We analyze details. We imagine scenarios. We become preoccupied. This is exactly why avoidants can suddenly start thinking about someone far more intensely after that person pulls away. The relationship is no longer predictable. It's no longer guaranteed. It's no longer safely stored in the background of their life. Now it feels uncertain. Now it feels fragile. Now it feels valuable. Human beings are wired to pay attention to potential loss. Think about it. Most people don't appreciate their health until they get sick. Most people don't appreciate time until it's running out. Most people don't appreciate opportunities until they're gone. The possibility of loss forces attention, and relationships are no different. When avoidants believe someone will always be there, they can keep their emotional investment hidden. But when that person starts disappearing, suppressed feelings often rise to the surface. Suddenly, memories become more vivid. Old conversations seem more meaningful. Shared experiences feel more important. The connection becomes impossible to ignore. What makes this process so confusing is that avoidants themselves often don't understand what's happening. They may tell themselves they're just curious. They may convince themselves they're simply bored. They may pretend they don't care. Yet they keep checking social media. They keep wondering what the other person is doing. They keep replaying interactions in their minds. They keep thinking about someone they supposedly moved on from. Why? Because beneath all the rationalizations, their attachment system has finally activated. The emotions they spent months or even years suppressing are demanding attention. And the more unavailable the other person becomes, the stronger that internal conflict can grow. This is the secret most people never realize. Avoidants often appear emotionally detached not because they lack feelings, but because they're actively managing feelings that scare them. The moment they fear losing someone important, those feelings can become impossible to suppress. And that's when the real psychological struggle begins. Because once an avoidant realizes they might actually lose you, they often enter a mental cycle that can make you occupy their thoughts far more than when you were constantly available. And that cycle is exactly what we're going to uncover next. The biggest mistake people make with avoidance is believing that distance means a lack of feelings. In reality, distance often means something entirely different. It means they're trying to control feelings that have become uncomfortable. And that's why the moment an avoidant senses they're genuinely losing someone, their behavior can begin changing in ways that seem completely unexpected. At first, the change is subtle. You won't usually see dramatic declarations of love. You won't hear emotional speeches. You won't suddenly receive endless messages. Avoidants rarely operate that way. Instead, the shift starts inside their mind, and that's where the obsession begins. Imagine spending months believing someone will always be there. You assume they'll answer your texts. You assume they'll remain emotionally invested. You assume they'll continue caring. Whether you consciously realize it or not, that person becomes part of your emotional environment. Like furniture in a room, they're simply there, reliable, predictable, available. Now imagine waking up one day and realizing they're gone. Not physically gone, emotionally gone. Their energy changes. Their attention shifts elsewhere. They stop chasing. They stop seeking validation. They stop trying to convince you of their worth. For many avoidants, this creates a psychological shock because suddenly the certainty they depended on disappears. And uncertainty is one of the most powerful triggers of mental fixation. The brain is designed to seek closure. When something important feels unfinished, it demands attention. Think about a movie that ends with a cliffhanger. You can't stop thinking about it. Think about a text message left unanswered. Your mind keeps returning to it. Think about a mystery with no solution. You become obsessed with finding answers. Relationships work the same way. The moment an avoidant realizes the connection is no longer secure, their mind often enters problem-solving mode. Why are they pulling away? Did I do something wrong? Have they met someone else? Why don't they seem affected? Do they still care? Could I get them back? The more questions that exist, the stronger the mental fixation becomes. This phenomenon is sometimes called the Zeigarnik effect. People tend to remember unfinished situations far more intensely than completed ones. An unresolved emotional connection can occupy enormous mental space. And for avoidants, who often leave emotions unprocessed, the effect can be even stronger. Here's where things become fascinating. While the relationship was active, the avoidant may have spent significant energy focusing on flaws. This is extremely common. Avoidants often unconsciously search for reasons to maintain emotional distance. They notice imperfections. They focus on incompatibilities. They emphasize minor problems. Not because they're trying to be cruel, but because their mind is protecting them from vulnerability. If they convince themselves the relationship isn't perfect, closeness feels less threatening. But once the relationship starts disappearing, something changes. The protective filter begins weakening. Now they stop focusing exclusively on flaws. Now they remember the good moments, the laughter, the late-night conversations, the comfort, the support, the emotional connection. The things they previously minimized suddenly become impossible to ignore. This is why some avoidants seem far more appreciative after a breakup than during the relationship itself. When the connection was available, they focused on maintaining distance. When the connection was unavailable, they finally recognize its value. And recognition often creates longing. Not because the relationship suddenly became perfect, but because loss changes perspective. Human beings naturally assign greater value to things they believe they can lose. Psychologists call this loss aversion. The pain of losing something is often stronger than the pleasure of having it. For avoidants, this principle can be incredibly powerful, because many avoidants don't fully experience the emotional significance of a relationship until they face the possibility of losing it. That's when their thoughts start racing. That's when memories become vivid. That's when curiosity turns into preoccupation. And that's when the ego becomes deeply involved. Remember, ego isn't simply arrogance. It's identity. It's the story we tell ourselves about who we are. Many avoidants secretly take pride in being emotionally self-sufficient. They see themselves as independent, strong, detached, unaffected. They believe they don't need anyone. At least, that's what they tell themselves. But what happens when reality challenges that belief? What happens when they can't stop thinking about someone? What happens when someone's absence affects their mood? What happens when they find themselves checking social media just to see if that person is okay? What happens when they feel jealous of people they supposedly don't care about? Suddenly, their self-image begins collapsing. Now they're forced to confront a truth they've spent years avoiding. Maybe I was attached. Maybe I cared more than I admitted. Maybe losing this person actually hurts. And that realization can be deeply uncomfortable. Because it exposes vulnerability, it proves they're not as emotionally detached as they believed. For some avoidants, this realization becomes the beginning of genuine emotional growth. But for others, it creates intense internal conflict. Part of them wants to reconnect. Part of them wants to retreat. Part of them misses the person. Part of them fears intimacy. Part of them wants answers. Part of them wants to avoid the entire situation. This internal battle can become exhausting, and the more uncertainty exists, the more attention the relationship receives. That's why avoidants sometimes appear obsessed after someone pulls away. They're not just thinking about the person, they're wrestling with unresolved emotions, unanswered questions, threatened identity, fear of loss, and attachment they can no longer deny. The result is a mental loop that keeps repeating itself. They think about the person, they try to distract themselves, the thoughts return. They convince themselves they've moved on. A memory appears. They feel relief. Then they feel longing. They feel curiosity. And then they feel fear. The cycle continues. And what makes this process even more powerful is that many avoidants never learned how to process these emotions in a healthy way. which means the feelings don't disappear. They often grow stronger, because suppressed emotions have a strange habit of demanding attention. The more you avoid them, the louder they become. And in the next part, we'll uncover the hidden reason avoidants sometimes become far more interested in someone after they stop being available, and why scarcity can trigger emotions that were invisible before. Here's the strange truth about avoidants. Many of them don't fully understand how much someone means to them until that person starts moving on. While you're constantly available, they can keep you in the background of their life. They know you're there. They know they can reach out whenever they want. Because of that certainty, they don't feel urgency. But the moment your attention shifts elsewhere, something changes. Suddenly, you're no longer guaranteed. And that's when their mind starts paying attention. This isn't because avoidants enjoy playing games. It's because human psychology values what feels scarce. Think about it. People often ignore opportunities until they're gone. They postpone decisions until deadlines arrive. They take things for granted until they lose them. Relationships work the same way. When an avoidant believes you'll always be there, they can suppress their feelings. When they realize you might not be there anymore, those feelings become harder to ignore. That's why many avoidants start thinking about someone more after a breakup than during the relationship itself. They replay memories, they remember inside jokes, they think about conversations, they wonder what you're doing. They start noticing the empty space you left behind. And the more they think about it, the more valuable the connection seems. Another reason this happens is because avoidants are often attracted to emotional safety, but they fear emotional dependence. As long as you're chasing them, they can maintain control. But once you stop chasing, they lose that control. Now they don't know where they stand. Now they're unsure of your feelings. Now they're facing the possibility that you may never come back. And uncertainty creates obsession. The human brain hates unanswered questions. That's why avoidants sometimes become intensely curious about people they previously seemed indifferent toward. They're trying to answer questions that suddenly matter. Do you still care? Are you seeing someone else? Have you moved on? Will they ever hear from you again? These questions keep looping in their mind. The irony is that many avoidants only begin confronting their true feelings after the relationship becomes uncertain. Before, they were focused on creating distance. Now, they're focused on understanding what they've lost. And that shift can completely change how they see you. The person they once viewed as always available suddenly becomes someone valuable, desirable, and difficult to replace. That's when the craving begins. Not because you've become a different person, but because your absence forced them to recognize your value. However, this doesn't always mean they'll reach out immediately. In fact, many avoidants do something very different. Instead of contacting you directly, they watch from a distance. One of the most confusing things about avoidance is this: they can miss you deeply and still not contact you. To most people, that makes no sense. If you miss someone, why not just reach out? But avoidants often have a different internal struggle. The moment they realize they still care, they also become aware of something else: the risk of rejection. What if you ignore them? What if you've moved on? What if contacting you makes them feel vulnerable? For someone with avoidant tendencies, those possibilities can feel extremely uncomfortable. So instead of reaching out, they often choose the safer option. They observe. They check your social media. They notice changes in your life. They pay attention to signs that you're happy, sad, single, or dating someone new. They want information without emotional exposure. In their mind, watching feels safer than risking rejection. This creates a strange situation. The avoidant may be thinking about you every day, wondering what you're doing, wondering who you're with, wondering whether you still care. Yet they remain silent, not because they feel nothing, but because feeling too much scares them. The more important you become, the more vulnerable they feel. And vulnerability is exactly what they've spent years trying to avoid. This is why some avoidants seem cold on the outside, while experiencing complete emotional chaos on the inside. They're fighting two opposing desires. One side wants connection. The other side wants protection. One side wants to reach out, the other side wants to stay safe. And that battle can continue for weeks, months, or even longer. Eventually, however, many avoidants reach a point where the fear of losing you becomes stronger than the fear of contacting you. And when that happens, their behavior can change dramatically. There comes a moment in some avoidants' lives when reality becomes impossible to ignore. For weeks or months, they may tell themselves they're fine. They may convince themselves they don't care. They may focus on work, hobbies, friends, or distractions. But deep down, one question keeps returning. What if they're really gone? And that's when everything starts changing. The person who once felt permanently available no longer feels available at all. The relationship that once seemed easy to revisit now feels uncertain. The door that was always open suddenly appears to be closing. For many avoidants, this is the moment their emotions become impossible to suppress. The memories become stronger. The regret becomes louder. The attachment becomes clearer. And for the first time, they stop focusing on why the relationship might not work and start focusing on what they could lose. This shift is powerful because avoidants often spend years protecting themselves from emotional pain. But when someone important starts moving on, they discover something surprising. Avoiding pain doesn't eliminate it. Sometimes it delays it. The feelings they ignored eventually catch up. The conversations they never had start replaying in their mind. The affection they never expressed suddenly feels important. The connection they took for granted begins to look irreplaceable. And this is where many people misunderstand avoidance. They assume avoidance never cared. But often the truth is simpler. The avoidant cared. They were just more focused on protecting themselves than expressing it. Only when loss becomes real do they fully recognize what the relationship meant. That's why some avoidants come back. That's why some suddenly reach out. That's why some start chasing after months of silence. They're no longer running from intimacy. They're running from regret. However, there's an important lesson here. You cannot build a healthy relationship by trying to hurt someone's ego. Real connection isn't created through manipulation. The deeper truth is that people often appreciate what they have only when they're at risk of losing it, and avoidants are no exception. The goal should never be to make someone obsessed. The goal should be to become someone who values themselves enough not to chase people who don't value them. Ironically, that's often when avoidance begins seeing you differently. When you stop proving your worth, when you stop begging for attention, when you stop making them the center of your world, when you start focusing on your own life, your confidence becomes visible, your absence becomes noticeable, your value becomes undeniable. And whether the avoidant returns or not, you've already won, because your happiness is no longer dependent on someone else's validation. And that is something far more powerful than obsession. It's freedom.